Radio TV phono nut here, and what we have is an Aiwa component style turntable from 2001. As you might expect, this is a fairly cheaply made plastic lightweight turntable. Not much to it, but I still suspect that it's better than this modern Crosley suitcase ceramic cartridge equipped junk that's available today. And I'll get into more as to why I bought this turntable in just a few minutes. I didn't pay much for it. This is going to be a guinea pig, if you will. As you can see, it's missing the turntable platter mat and the stylus tip on the Audio-Technica cartridge is busted off, but both of those problems are easily remedied. I've already fired this up, and it seems to run on both speeds and goes through all of its automatic functions, so that's a good sign. As far as controls, we have our speed select switch between 33 and 45. We have a start and stop and arm cueing buttons here, as well as a size select for the automatic function, 12-inch or 7-inch. And if you look here, we have a little slide switch there that disables the internal phono preamp, which is a nice feature that allows you to switch on the preamp and plug this turntable into say an amplifier that does not have a magnetic phono input, or a pair of our powered speakers or whatever. Or if you want to connect the turntable to a receiver or amplifier that has a magnetic phono input, you just turn the switch off and it bypasses the preamp. Now, I'm inclined to believe that this turntable uses the same mechanism as the Audio-Technica AT-LP60. Based on the control layout, the control placement and functions are exactly the same as on the Audio-Technica models. The only difference I see between the two is the case design is maybe a little bit different on the Audio-Technica, and the Audio-Technica uses an aluminum turntable platter, whereas this one uses a plastic platter. Now, I remember back in the early 90s when these kind of turntables first came out. Might not have been exactly like this, but it was about in the early 90s when vinyl was considered a dead format, and what turntables were made for the most part was pretty much cheap plastic stuff that was mainly geared towards people who had records that they wanted to occasionally play, who maybe haven't replaced their records with CD copies yet. I remember in about 1994 or 5, I bought a TIAC turntable, which you would consider a black plastic crap model. You know, I was a teenager, and what did I know? I thought a newer turntable would be better. I think I paid around $100 for it, and you know, for an entry-level turntable, it wasn't too bad. It was nicer than this one. It had an aluminum platter and had automatic record size sensing. I don't remember what cartridge was in it, but it was not an Audio-Technica cartridge, and it was a cartridge that was integrated into the tone arm just like this one is. But after 2 or 3 years of use, I accidentally broke the stylus tip. Didn't have internet access at that time, and nobody around here had a stylus and had no clue as to where I could get one. So I ended up giving the turntable to a friend of mine, and I don't know what I think he ended up finding a needle for it. I don't know. And from that point on, I basically started using older, heavier duty component type turntables. Now, my reason for buying this one is it's 2-speed, but I want to try to convert it to 3-speed so we can have 78 RPM capability. Now, ideally, if you have a 3-speed turntable, it would be nice to have one with detachable head shells where you can have one head set up for microgroove and the other head set up for 78 RPM playback, since 78s usually require a 3mm stylus, whereas a stereo microgroove record requires a 0.7mm or 0.6mm in some cases, depending on the cartridge stylus. I think these Audio-Technicas use a 0.6mm conical stylus, but this particular turntable doesn't have a detachable head. However, the needles do pop out easily, and the 78 RPM needles for this cartridge are easily available. So if you happen to find one of these turntables cheap and are on a budget, as in you don't have several $100s to fork out for a nicer 3-speed turntable, you can convert one of these to 3-speed without too much trouble. Get the proper stylus, and you've got you a 3-speed turntable on the cheap until you can do better. But as far as the current Audio-Technica entry-level turntables, that are between about 80 and $100, depending on where you shop. And I've told people, instead of buying one of those Crosleys, if you insist on buying a new turntable and don't have a lot of cash to spend, buy one of those entry-level Audio-Technica turntables and get you a set of powered speakers, and for $150 you've got you something that will play your records in a respectable fashion. And you can spend $100 to $150 or more on some of that Crosley suitcase garbage with the ceramic cartridge and the 1-inch speakers in them. Here's the label on the back, made in China, which is no surprise, which is pretty much where they're all made now, except for maybe some of the exotic, expensive ones, and manufactured March 2001. I remember back around that time, the preacher at the church I was going to at the time was telling me that he bought a new Aiwa shelf system, and it came with one of these turntables, and he went on to tell me that he didn't own any records, had no use for the turntable, and he was going to just give it to me, but for whatever reason that never happened. You know how that goes. If I had every radio and TV and record player and whatnot that someone told me I could have, then I'd need another building. Okay, on the bottom it says risk of electric shock, do not open. Well, I think I'll take that risk and open it anyway. Now, as you can see, here's the underside, not much to it. The motor looks very similar to what I call the Crosley motor, only this motor looks like a Matsushita motor, so it should be a little bit better quality than what's in the Crosley junk. Okay, technically this is a 2-speed motor with these adjustment holes for each speed. High is for 45, low is for 33, and we have 4 terminals here, minus and plus. That's where your DC goes in, roughly 9 volts, 12 volts, whatever. And the motor, as you can see, has a regulator IC on it to keep the speed stable regardless of voltage fluctuation. And we have this 33-45 switch that when placed in 45, it shorts these 2 terminals out to increase the speed to give you 45 RPM. Alright, I drew up a couple of motor wiring schematics. The first one is of that MPC late 90s classroom record player that's 3-speed, and the second one is a Crosley Cruiser that I EOL'd. The MPC record player and the Crosley both use similar looking motors, but the MPC record player has a 4-plug, 4-pin terminal on it, while the Crosley has 5 pins. So I think the MPC motor matches our Aiwa motor, so we'll go with that diagram. So we have a minus and plus designation on the top 2 motor terminals. That's where our 9 to 12 volts comes in. And then the bottom 2 terminals determine the speed. When those 2 terminals are left open, we're at 33. But when the terminals are shorted via means of the speed select switch, then that brings the motor up to 45. Now, in order to get 78, on the MPC record player, they used a single pole double throw switch with a center off position, and you can use a toggle switch or rocker switch or whatever, just so it's a single pole double throw center off type. So when you're in the center position, no connection is made, and that sets the motor to 33 RPM. Or actually, the motor runs a lot faster than that, but it runs the turntable at 33 RPM. Then when we flip the switch to 45 RPM position, it shorts out those two bottom terminals, and that brings the speed up to, turntable speed up to 45 RPM. Then when we switch to the 78 RPM position, that connects one end of a potentiometer up here to the next to the bottom pin on the motor, and then the other end of the potentiometer connects to the pin 1 of the four-legged regulator IC on the motor. And in the MPC record player, that's a 500 ohm pot, and they have it set to about 160 ohms. In the Crosley record player, they use about a 300 ohm pot, and it's set to about the same resistance, and that gets us up to 78 RPM. Now on the Crosleys, you can see we have 5 pins on the motor plug. Minus and plus is where the 9 to 12 volts comes in, and in the center of our switch goes up to the 3rd pin from the top, and then when we flip it to 45, that connects the 3rd pin to the 5th pin, and then when we flip it to 78, that connects a 300 ohm pot that's wide as a rheostat between pin 3 and pin 4, as you can see here. Now, like I said, the motors look alike in the MPC and the Aiwa and the Crosleys. The only difference, the one in the Aiwa is a Matsushita. I'm pretty sure the one in the MPC is a Matsushita also. The one in the Crosley is just some China crap, but the Matsushita motor should be of better quality. So I think what we'll do for a test, we'll leave the main speed switch in the 33 position, which is open, and then we'll connect a pot. We'll rob the one out of the Crosley Cruiser that I EOL'd and connect it between this pin here, which is pin 3 from the top here, between that and pin number 1 on this regulator IC, and see if it runs at approximately 78 RPM. And if it does, then we will remove all of this completely and just put a 3-position switch here on the front to select between 45 to the left, 33 in the center, and then 78 to the right, just like on the MPC record player. But as you can see, there's no kind of external voltage regulation circuitry or motor driver circuitry or anything like that. All of that is internal to the motor here. All we have here is a power transformer which steps the incoming 120 volts AC line voltage down to, let's say for the sake of argument, 12 volts AC or 9 volts AC, just pick a number, which is rectified by this bridge rectifier network here, and then filtered by this electrolytic capacitor here, and then that supplies your 9 or 12 volts or whatever DC to the motor, and then everything is internally regulated to keep the motor on speed inside the motor here. Okay, we're down here in the hellhole, otherwise known as my workshop. It's gotten way out of control out here. Need to empty it out and do a little throwing away and clean it up, but it seems like every day there's been chances of rain, you know, these little pop-up storms, and the last thing I need is to have stuff drug out in the yard and up comes a shower, and the weatherman says that the forecast is really not going to change for at least the next 3 months. So it's been about the wettest summer down here in the south that I remember, and especially in recent years. Alright, I took the little auxiliary control board out of a junk Crosley cruiser that has our pod on it, and I have the potentiometer connected to the appropriate place on the motor, and that indeed speeds up the turntable. And it looks like we're running at about 78 RPM. And it's pretty quiet. Now, one difference I've noticed between this turntable and, say, the Crosley Cruisers, the Crosley Cruiser style turntables are, well, record players would be more accurate. The Crosleys are noisier because they don't have the motors isolated from the mechanism. They're screwed directly to the plastic turntable mechanism, whereas this one has rubber mounting bushings to keep the motor isolated, so there's not as much noise transfer. Now all we need to do is get an appropriate switch to put on the front here, and then we can wire this all up permanently and have 3 speeds at the touch of a button. Dadgummit, go out of focus, why don't you? The one thing I don't like about these cheaper turntables, and it drives me nuts, you see how that plater's moving up and down. That's a characteristic of a cheap turntable. I don't know if the metal plater on the Audio-Technica models would be any better. If I found one of those turntables that was junk, I might transplant the metal plater off of it onto this one if it would fit, but you know, for what this is going to be used for, I guess it's no big deal. Like I think I've already said, this is not really the best choice for a 78 RPM turntable, but if you're on a budget and find one of these cheap or have one laying around, it's easy enough to convert it to 78 RPM, and you'll have something to spin your disc on until you can come up with something better. Now you notice when I unplug the potentiometer, it goes back to 33, which is what it's supposed to do. So what we'll now need to do is get a suitable switch, mount this potentiometer somewhere on the chassis underneath here where it can be adjusted, and get a suitable plater mat and a stylus, and then we'll need to get a strobe disc and set the speeds 33, 45, and 78, and it's best to do that with a record on the turntable, so because the weight of the record will determine the rotational speed of the plater. If the plater is not loaded down and you set it for the right speed, and when you put a heavy record on it, then that might slow it down, so best to do it with a record on the turntable. And whenever I adjust this pod, I can get it running super fast, really faster than it will ever need to run, fast enough that it would probably wear the motor out a lot quicker if I left it that way. However, I can't get it low enough to run at, say, 16 RPM or 8 RPM for talking books. I'd like to figure out a way to modify one of these cheapy turntables to do all 5 speeds, 8, 16, 33, 45, and 78, and that way we could run the whole spectrum just about. And it would even be nicer to even have a pitch control on there to deviate plus or minus from the selected speed, so that way you could pretty much play anything. Now the lower the resistance of the potentiometer, the faster it turns, so maybe if we used a higher resistance pot, say maybe a 1K ohm or something, we could dial this in to a lower speed, but that may be something we experiment later, but right now I just want to make this a 3-speed turntable, 33, 45, and 78. Now another thing, it's really no big deal as far as playing 78s, is this size selector is only indexed for 12 and 7-inch records. And the majority of 78s that you find are going to be 10 inches in diameter, which means, of course, you can still play them, but you can't use the automatic start feature. You'll have to place the tone arm manually on the record. About the only 78s that are 12 inches are mainly classical records, and an occasional longer record that's longer than the typical, 2.5, 3 minutes that you can get on a regular 10-inch record. So they, of course, had to make those in 12-inch variety that would allow up to, about 4 minutes or so on a 12-inch 78. I don't remember. And then, of course, you've got the little 7-inch Bell 78s from the 50s. You can play those automatically on here, but any size other than 7 or 10 inch, you're going to have to place the tone arm manually on the record. Now, if the post office gets their butt in gear and gets me my switches tomorrow, we ought to be able to take care of this. What I plan on doing is removing all of this and filing out this hole to make it bigger so we can put a rocker switch in here. All the way to the left will be 45, center will be 33, and all the way to the right will be 78. And if there's room, I'll put some little labels on here to that effect. Okay, I was going to put the speed change switch right here, but the hole here is a little bit too wide and it would look tacky. So I put a hole up here on top of the motor board, but I goofed, as you can see, goofed in 2 ways. My file slipped as I was bringing it out, and I scratched the plastic, but I can put a speed label over that, or indicator label, and I filed my hole crooked, so the switch is not in there exactly straight, but oh well, this is the guinea pig anyway, so it really don't matter. Any I do in the future, I'll try to do a neater job with. So I guess at this point I can't say anything about whoever made that MPC record player doing a crap job. So now all we have to do is go in here and wire everything up, and then it ought to be good to go. Okay, we have the modification taken care of. The most tricky part was right here. You see on the newer Crosley motors, they give you a 5-pin connection here with 1 pin going over to the pin number 1 on this regulator. But on these older 4-pin motors, you have to make the connection directly to the regulator, and since those pins are kind of spaced together, it's kind of tedious getting the extra wire soldered on there without having anything short out, which happened to me twice during the efforts, but we got it done. Alright, this little circuit board here, that was salvaged out of the Crosley Cruiser. However, if you don't have a Crosley Cruiser to salvage a circuit board out of, it's no problem. You can either make a little board out of a piece of a phenolic board, or you can take a terminal strip and screw it to a convenient point on the inside the turntable, and then mount the trim pot to the terminal strip. I just simply mounted the circuit board right here where part of the original speed control switch assembly was, and it's not something I have to do right now, but it would also be a good idea to put a little bit of epoxy to epoxy this plastic piece to the circuit board here. That way it won't never move. And if we have to remove the circuit board for anything, which the only reason I can think of would be to have to replace this trim pot, just take this screw out and that screw out and lift the whole thing out. So here's what we did. Center pin, center terminal of the rocker switch goes over here and connects to pin number 3, 1, 2, and 3 on the connector tab here on the motor. And then our 45 RPM side of the switch, the yellow wire, comes around here and connects to pin number 4 right there on the motor connection board. And then our 78 side of the switch, one side of it goes over here and connects to one end of this potentiometer, and then the other end of the potentiometer, the green wire, comes over here and solders to pin 1 of this little 4-legged regulator IC. And like I said, that's kind of tricky to get that soldered on there without anything shorting out. And then, like I said, if you have a modern Crosley motor with a 5-pin connector on here, sometimes they plug in, sometimes they're hardwired, but there'll already be a pin there that connects to this pin 1 on the regulator IC, so that will make it easier for you. I could have just swapped this motor out for one of the junk Crosley Cruiser motors, but I think this Matt Schuster motor is probably a better motor. Now I need to drill a hole in the bottom of the turntable to allow easy access to adjust this trim pot for 78 RPM without having to pull the turntable apart. Well, I blew it again. As it turns out, where the pot is mounted just happens to be in the way of where one of the legs would be for an adjustment hole, so just going to have to remove one of the legs if we have to adjust this. And then I got my hole in the wrong place, so we had to enlarge that a little bit so I could fit a small screwdriver up in there to adjust the 78 RPM pot. Now I think we're ready to put it all back together and go get a strobe disc and adjust this thing for the proper speed. Alright, 33, 45, back to 33, and 78. This record's pretty scratchy and beautiful. Alright, I brought out my new Chinesium 666 stylus pressure gauge, and it says this is tracking at 3.5 grams, which is where it's supposed to track, so that's good. This particular tone arm does not use a counterweight, instead it uses a counterbalance spring. But we know over time, sometimes those springs will lose their tension, so it's always best to check them and make sure they're within the right range. Only thing I don't like about this little gauge, it only goes up to 5 grams. I wished it went higher than that, but I guess they figure most people that have these are only going to be using them on decent turntables. They're not going to be using them on the old changers and whatnot that track at 10+ grams. I borrowed a mat off of another turntable as well as an LP stylus while I wait on the 78 stylus that I ordered to show up, as well as a cork mat that I ordered off of eBay. The reason I ordered a cork mat is because it was cheaper than the rubber mats I was finding. I wasn't paying 20 or 30 bucks for a rubber mat for this cheapo turntable. Heck, with the LP and 78 needle and the mat that I ordered, plus what I paid for the turntable, heck, I'll end up with about as much in this as probably what I could have bought a new one for, but the new one wouldn't be set up to play 78, so there's the difference. Now if you modify one of these cheap turntables with the built-in preamp, keep in mind that the preamp is for RIAA equalization for LPs and 45s. However, most 78s have different equalization curves, which means the RIA curve won't sound right. Yeah, you can play your records, but they may sound muddy and not very vibrant. So on that note, if at all possible, you probably want to switch the internal preamp out of circuit and plug the output of the turntable into a preamp that has the various EQ curves for 78. There's several models out there. There's one that I think costs about $60 that just has a simple slide switch, 78 and LP. And then there's another one, which is the one I have that I finally broke down and bought, that cost about $125, $130. It has a few more various EQ options. And then after that, you get up into preamps that cost hundreds, if not over $1,000, and that's just not in my budget. What I found out with the preamp that I bought, when I set it to the proper EQ curve, the actual sound quality of the record is better, but the surface noise from the record being worn is more pronounced. Whereas when you play the record back in RIA equalization, the surface noise is not as prevalent. So, but like I said, if you're an avid 78 RPM collector, you would probably want to invest in something better than one of these cheapo turntables. You'd probably want something like an Audio-Technica, what's the model number of that thing, AT-LP120, I think. That's like looks similar to a Technics 1200, only it has 78 speed from the factory. However, if you only have a few 78s that you may want to play and don't want to spend a bunch of money just to play those, or if you want a cheap turntable, a cheap second turntable to play 78, something like this might fit the bill for you. You know, if you're handy with a soldering iron, this particular mod is not very difficult. And if I get any more of these types of turntables that are in nicer cosmetic shape, I will strive to be a little bit neater with my switch placement, as in don't make the cutout crooked for it, but you know, for what this is, it's really no big deal. This is kind of a little bit beat up anyway. Okay, preamp is on, and I'm plugged into the auxiliary input of this Audiotronics record player, and I've already checked both left and right channels. They're both passing a signal, so that's good. So let's see what we got. Well, considering I haven't adjusted the speed pots, that's pretty close. There's one of those top 78s with 2 songs per side. Mono LP. That sounds okay. And now a mono 45. And it seems to be working fine. That's what we want to hear. Okay, I got my new mat and my 78 RPM needle from the VM site. We have the turntable connected to the mixer here, and we're using the built-in preamp and the turntable and then the output of the mixer I have connected to the Crosley here. The only reason I have the mixer here is because I don't have the proper cable. I need a cable with 2 female RCA jacks to 1/8 inch male stereo plug, but the cable I have has 2 male RCA jacks to a 1/8 inch stereo male plug, so we're just basically using the mixer for a cable adapter, if you will, but it accomplishes the same thing, and that's a test for what we're doing here. And I can tell you that the record sounds better played through the turntable and going through the mixer and into the line level input on the Crosley than it does playing the record directly on the Crosley, and part of that's because of the impedance mismatch between the ceramic cartridge and the Crosley and the amplifier, but that's a subject for another video. But anyway, this is a 33 RPM record. Whoop, hit the wrong button. Now 45. Don't want to let that play too long. We don't need any copyright crap. And now we'll do a 78, so we'll just switch our needle out. And we have our green 78 needle on. Let's turn our mixer down some. And it sounds good.
When I'm worried and I can't sleep, I count my blessings instead of sheep.
Okay, so now all that's left to do is get a strobe disc, which I can't find mine at the moment, and fine-tune the speed, but there's really no need in me showing that. I'm ready to end this, but the best way to do that is do it with a record on the platter. So you'll be properly loading down the motor, and then I like to use a 120 volt neon indicator lamp with just a power cord attached to it, and then I can hold the lamp over the disc and adjust the speed trimmers on the underside of the turntable until the dots for the corresponding speed appear stationary. And like I said, like I said before, you either want to use a non-conductive small screwdriver or a screwdriver with some tape wrapped around it, so you don't accidentally short the trimmer out to the case of the motor. It won't damage anything, it'll just cause the motor to run wide open. So that's pretty much all that's left to do here. And I'm probably going to put another label on here that indicates green needle for 78, yellow needle for LP. And that'll be the most tricky thing, being careful with swapping the needles out, is not to damage them. And on that note, it would probably be better if you had 2 of these turntables, one set up for 78 and one set up for LP, and then you wouldn't have to swap anything out. Now, like I think I might have already said earlier in the video, these turntables are very common under many different brands. You've got the Aiwa, Sony, Denon, Audio-Technica, Crosley, and there's probably more of them that have this same basic layout with your 3 buttons here, your speed selector here, and your size selector here. You know, there'll be some cosmetic differences, and I think the newest Crosley version uses a different type tone arm with standard 1/2-inch mounting, but underneath the mechanics and the motor and all that is pretty much all going to be the same. Now, if you have a nicer turntable that you might not want to put a hole in right here to put a switch in, you could always put a slide switch under the platter here, so that way when you needed to change speeds, all you had to do was lift up your mat and flip the switch through this opening here, and you had the proper speed without having to drill a hole in your turntable here. But like I've already said, this one's kind of beat up anyway, so it don't much matter. And what you were just hearing was a 78 played through the RIAA equalized preamp, and for better results you would probably want to switch out the internal preamp and plug the turntable into a preamp that provides the dedicated 78 EQ curves. But if you don't have such a thing, then obviously you can still play the records using the RIAA curve position. You're not going to damage anything. In fact, I played 78s that way for years, and then I finally broke down and bought one of those $140, $150 Reco-Cut preamps, and if you have a 78 it's in really nice shape, using the right curve really helps it sound better. But if you have a 78 that's pretty worn, like most of mine are, playing them with the right EQ curve just brings out the surface noise more. So in that case, if you got worn records, you might be better off playing them through the RIAA standard equalization curve. It'll cut down on the surface noise. But anyway, I'm about ready to wrap this up. Just a cheap way to convert a cheap turntable to 3 speeds, and it doesn't take very long at all to do. If you have everything in order, everything you need in front of you, you know you can do this in probably 15-20 minutes, and you have a 3-speed turntable. Alright, enough of that, and more to come later.